There are moments in history that no one plans for. Moments that arrive quietly, without warning, and then settle into people's hearts so deeply that they carry them for the rest of their lives. What happened between Prince William and Princess Catherine was one of those moments. It was not a headline written to shock you. It was not a rumor passed from mouth to mouth across the internet. It was real and it was painful, and the truth behind it is far more powerful than anything the tabloids ever managed to print. This is a story about two people who stood side by side for decades, through weddings and funerals, through the death of a queen, through illness and public pressure that would have broken almost anyone. And it is a story about what love looks like when it is tested in ways that ordinary people will never fully understand. The world first fell in love with them as a pair, not just because they were royal, and not just because their wedding in April 2011 drew nearly 2 billion viewers to television screens across the globe, but because something about them felt honest. William was not performing the role of a prince who had everything figured out. Kate was not pretending to be a woman without fear or struggle. Together, they seemed to be doing something that royals before them had rarely managed. They seemed to be genuinely trying. For millions of people who watched them over the years, that trying meant something. It meant the late nights of charity work, the visits to hospitals and hospices and food banks where William and Kate would sit beside people in real pain and not look away. It meant the speeches about mental health that William gave when no man in his position was supposed to admit to feelings of grief or loneliness. It meant the way Kate, over years of quiet and careful work, transformed herself from a young woman under impossible scrutiny into one of the most respected figures in modern British public life. But behind all of that light, there was always a shadow. The shadow of a family that had never fully healed from the death of Princess Diana. The shadow of a monarchy that demanded everything and gave very little in return. The shadow of a public life so total, so consuming, that even the most private moments, a child's first steps, a diagnosis that should have been kept between a woman and her doctor, became news that hundreds of millions of people felt entitled to consume and debate and dissect. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped forward in early 2024 to tell the world that she had been diagnosed with cancer, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People wept in the streets of London. They laid flowers outside Kensington Palace. They wrote letters by the thousands. They lit candles. A woman they had never met, a woman whose life most of them could not begin to imagine, had shared something deeply private and deeply frightening. And in doing so, she had pulled something loose in the collective chest of a watching world. What followed was not a fairy tale. What followed was something much harder and much more human than that. It was a young family, 3 children under the age of 12, navigating a cancer diagnosis in front of the entire planet. It was a husband trying to hold a household together while performing the public duties of a future king and sitting beside a wife who was going through chemotherapy. It was a woman of extraordinary composure trying to protect her children from knowing how frightened she was. And it was, eventually, a farewell of a kind, not the permanent and devastating farewell that the world feared in those early months, but a farewell nonetheless. A farewell to the life they had built. A farewell to the version of themselves that had existed before the diagnosis. A farewell that left millions of people around the world grieving something they could not quite name. To understand what that farewell truly meant, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning the press likes to tell, the fairytale courtship at St. Andrews, the long engagement, the dress, the kiss on the balcony. You have to go back to what was really there underneath all of that. You have to understand who William and Kate actually were before the world decided who they should be. William Arthur Philip Louis was born on June 21, 1982, in the Lindo wing of St. Mary's Hospital in London. He was the first child of Charles, then Prince of Wales, and Diana, Princess of Wales, and from the moment he arrived, the weight of an entire institution settled onto his small shoulders. The photographers were waiting outside the hospital before his mother had even recovered. The headlines were written before he had taken his first breath. He was not simply a baby. He was, in the eyes of the British press and the British public, a symbol of continuity, of hope, of a monarchy that had survived centuries and intended to survive centuries more. What the headlines never quite managed to capture was the reality of what it meant to grow up inside that symbol. To be the child of 2 people whose marriage was quietly and then very publicly falling apart. To sit in classrooms at prep school and hear the other boys talking about something your mother had said on television, something private, something painful, something she had shared with the world because she felt she had no other choice. To be 9 years old and understand, in the way that children understand things before they have the words for it, that your family was not safe in the way that other families were safe. Diana Spencer had married into the royal family in 1981, at the age of 20, when she was still young enough to believe that love and goodness could survive inside an institution that had been built to outlast both. She was warm and instinctive and deeply attuned to human suffering in a way that felt almost unusual in royal circles. She visited AIDS patients at a time when most of the world was still treating the disease like a moral failing. She walked through minefields in Angola to draw attention to the devastation of landmines. She held dying children. She sat with homeless men on the streets of London and looked them directly in the eyes. She was also, by her own account in the famous 1995 Panorama interview, an interview that shocked a nation and changed the monarchy forever, deeply unhappy. The marriage had broken down. There had been infidelity. There had been isolation and a sense of being trapped inside a role she had not been fully prepared for. And there were two little boys, William and his younger brother Harry, who were watching all of it. William was 15 years old on August 31, 1997, when the call came to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where the royal family was on summer holiday. His mother had been in a car accident in Paris. She had not survived. Charles woke both boys in the early hours of the morning and told them what had happened, and then the family attended church that same morning, because that was what was required. That was what duty demanded, even on the morning after the worst thing that had ever happened to them. The grief that followed was not private. It could not be. Diana had belonged to the world in a way that very few human beings ever do, and the world mourned her with a ferocity that sometimes felt more like rage than sadness. The flowers outside Buckingham Palace stretched for miles. The queue to sign the condolence books wound through the streets for hours. And in the middle of all of it were two boys, 15 and 12, who were supposed to walk behind their mother's coffin in front of the cameras of every television network on Earth. They did walk. They walked with their father, with their grandfather, Prince Philip, and with their maternal grandfather, Earl Spencer, down the Mall and through the streets of London. William's face, in photographs from that day, is one of the most haunting images in recent British history. Not because he was crying, but because he was not, because he had already learned at 15 what it meant to carry grief in public, what it meant to hold your face still when everything inside you was breaking. That lesson, the lesson of composure, of duty, of continuing to move forward even when the ground beneath you has given way, would define the next 3 decades of his life. It would shape the king he was becoming, and it would eventually collide, in ways no one could have predicted, with the crisis that arrived in the winter of 2024. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton was born on January 9, 1982, in Reading, Berkshire, which meant that she and William were just months apart in age, though their worlds at birth could not have been more different. Her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, were self-made in the truest sense. Michael had worked as a flight dispatcher, and Carol as an air hostess before they founded Party Pieces in 1987, a mail-order company selling party supplies that would eventually grow into a highly successful business. The Middletons were comfortable, and they were close, and the warmth of that closeness would turn out to be one of the most important things Kate ever carried with her into her marriage. She was a bright and athletic girl, sporty, grounded, not particularly drawn to the spotlight. She attended Marlborough College in Wiltshire, where she was remembered by contemporaries as quiet and determined and kind. She went to St. Andrews University in Scotland, where she enrolled in the History of Art program, and where, in the first weeks of the first term, she met a young man named William Wales, who was studying geography, and who had a habit of turning up in the cafeteria with his bodyguards trying very hard to blend into the walls. Their friendship was slow and genuine before it was anything else. They were part of the same social group, the same circle of friends who would gather in each other's rooms on weekend evenings and talk and laugh, and be young people for a few hours before the rest of the world reasserted itself. William, by all accounts, was drawn to Kate's steadiness. She did not treat him as a prince in the way that so many people felt compelled to. She treated him as a person. She argued with him when she thought he was wrong. She laughed at him when he was being ridiculous. She was, in the language of ordinary life, simply his friend. They became more than friends in their second year. They lived together with other housemates in a student flat in St. Andrews, and what began as the comfortable closeness of shared space gradually became something more. By their third year they were, by most accounts, genuinely in love, a fact that the outside world would not officially acknowledge for several more years, because neither of them was ready, and because Kate knew better than almost anyone what acknowledgement would cost. She was right to be cautious. When the relationship did become known, when the photographers began appearing outside the flat, when her image began showing up in the tabloids, when the press started the long project of making her into a character in a story she had not agreed to join, the cost was exactly as high as she had feared. There were years of scrutiny so relentless it would have driven most people away. There were periods when the relationship was under such pressure that it did, in fact, break, most publicly in 2007, when William and Kate separated for a period of several months before finding their way back to each other. They were engaged in October 2010 on a trip to Kenya, where William presented Kate with his mother's sapphire and diamond engagement ring, a gesture that carried a weight of meaning that no one in that moment could fully articulate. Diana's ring, Diana's memory, Diana's legacy being carried forward into a new generation by the son who had spent 30 years learning how to grieve without falling apart. The wedding, on April 29, 2011, was watched by somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people worldwide. Westminster Abbey was filled with dignitaries and family members, and a congregation that included the man who had been Archbishop of Canterbury and the man who would become one. Kate's dress, designed by Sarah Burton of Alexander McQueen, was everything the fashion world had hoped for, elegant and English, and somehow both modern and timeless at once. William, in his red military uniform, looked at his bride with an expression that even the most cynical observer found difficult to dismiss. They said their vows quietly, clearly, with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than rehearsal. And then they stepped out into the spring sunshine of a London morning, into the roar of a crowd that stretched from the gates of Buckingham Palace all the way down the Mall, and they kissed on the balcony, twice, because the crowd demanded it, and something shifted in the air. Something that felt to the millions watching like hope. Like the possibility that this time, with these two people, the story might end differently. For a while it did seem to. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No life of that intensity and that visibility could be without difficulty. But they were also full of something genuine. 3 children arrived, George in July 2013, Charlotte in May 2015, and Louis in April 2018. Each birth was celebrated with the particular mixture of public jubilation and private tenderness that had come to define the way William and Kate moved through the world. They were careful with their children in a way that spoke to something deliberate, a conscious decision to protect them from the kind of exposure that had marked William's own childhood, to give them as much of an ordinary life as the extraordinary circumstances allowed. Kate, in those years, was quietly becoming something that the palace had not quite anticipated. She was not merely a princess. She was a working member of the royal family in the fullest sense, developing a serious and sustained focus on early childhood development, on mental health, on the well-being of children in their most formative years. The work was not glamorous in the way that ribbon cuttings and state banquets were glamorous. It was the kind of work that required reading research papers and sitting with experts, and listening very carefully to people who were doing difficult jobs in difficult circumstances. It was the kind of work that revealed, over years, a genuine intelligence and a genuine commitment that had nothing to do with the crown she would one day wear. William, beside her, was doing his own navigating. The transition from prince to heir apparent, which came with the death of Queen Elizabeth in September 2022, and his father's accession to the throne, changed the landscape of their lives in ways both visible and invisible. The title changed. The responsibilities changed. The weight on his shoulders, already considerable, grew heavier. And through all of it, the constant in his life remained the woman he had met at university in Scotland, the woman who had chosen this impossible life knowingly, and had never, in all the years since, given any indication that she regretted it. And then came January 2024, and everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong reached the public in January 2024, though the truth had been unfolding in private for weeks before that. Kensington Palace released a brief statement confirming that Catherine, Princess of Wales, had undergone a planned abdominal surgery in London and was recovering. The statement was careful, measured, deliberately unspecific in the way that royal communications tend to be, offering just enough information to acknowledge reality while maintaining as much privacy as the circumstances allowed. Catherine was expected to remain out of public duties until after Easter. She was recovering well. There was nothing further to say at this time. What followed those initial statements was something unusual, even by the standards of a family accustomed to public scrutiny. Catherine disappeared, not in the way that public figures sometimes retreat, not with occasional sightings, not with carefully managed appearances designed to reassure an anxious public. She was simply not there. The woman who had been one of the most photographed people on Earth for more than a decade was suddenly invisible, and the absence itself became the story. The internet in the weeks that followed became a place of extraordinary speculation. Social media platforms filled with theories about what had really happened, where Catherine was, whether the photographs that eventually emerged were genuine or digitally altered. There was a photo of Catherine in a car, and then questions about whether it was really her. There was a Mother's Day photograph, released through official channels, that Catherine herself later acknowledged had been edited, an admission made quickly and honestly, the explanation being that she, like many amateur photographers, had adjusted the image and had not anticipated the level of scrutiny it would receive. The admission was straightforward. The furor that surrounded it was not. For months, the world watched and waited and speculated, and in the middle of all of that noise, inside the walls of Adelaide Cottage at Windsor, the modest four-bedroom house to which William and Kate had moved their family in 2022, choosing it specifically for its relative simplicity, for the way it allowed their children to walk to school and play in the grounds without the formality of a palace. A woman was fighting for her health. And a husband was fighting to hold everything together, while also fighting his own private battle with fear. William, during those months of early 2024, reduced his public engagements significantly. He canceled a planned trip to attend a memorial service. He stepped back from several commitments. The palace said he was supporting his wife. The press speculated endlessly about what that meant, what it looked like, what was happening behind the closed doors of that Windsor home. And through all of it, the three children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, then 10, 8, and 5 years old, were going to school in the mornings and coming home in the afternoons and living, as children do, in a world that their parents were working very hard to keep stable for them. On March 22, 2024, Catherine released a video. She filmed it herself in a quiet corner of Windsor Great Park, with the light of early spring coming in behind her and the weight of the weeks preceding it visible in her face in a way that no amount of composure could fully conceal. She looked directly at the camera, at the world, and she told the truth. She had been diagnosed with cancer. She did not specify the type, and she was not obligated to. She said that she and William had been working very hard to explain the situation to George, Charlotte, and Louis in age-appropriate ways, and that they had asked for time as a family to understand what was happening and to cope with it privately before addressing the wider world. She said that she was in the early stages of preventative chemotherapy. She said that she was well. She said that she hoped the public would understand the need for privacy and the desire to protect her children. And then she said something that caught in the throat of everyone who heard it. She said that life, as you know it, can change in an instant. She was not speaking in abstractions. She was speaking from the middle of that change. The response was seismic. The video was watched hundreds of millions of times within hours of its release. The statements of support came from politicians and royals and celebrities and ordinary people in quantities that were genuinely difficult to process. The British public, which had spent weeks in a state of anxious speculation, seemed to release something in that moment, a breath they had been holding, a tension they had not fully acknowledged until it was addressed. And underneath the relief of finally knowing the truth was something else. A grief, quiet and real, for a woman who had seemed so steady and so strong that the idea of her being ill felt like a rupture in the fabric of something people had taken for granted. For William, the months that followed the video were defined by a kind of balancing act that most people would find impossible to sustain. He was the heir to the British throne. He had responsibilities that could not simply be paused, engagements that required his presence, duties that the institution he was preparing to lead demanded he fulfill. He was also the husband of a woman receiving cancer treatment, the father of 3 children who needed stability and reassurance, and a man carrying his own fear in a context where showing too much of that fear was understood to be a luxury he could not afford. The people who know William, the small circle of close friends who have been with him since university, the aides who have worked alongside him for years, have spoken in careful and guarded terms about the particular texture of that period. about a man who was doing everything and feeling the weight of everything and choosing every day to keep going because the alternative, stopping, breaking, allowing the enormity of what was happening to overwhelm him, was simply not something the circumstances permitted. There is a pattern in William's life that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. It is the pattern of a man who was taught, at the most formative age, that the way you love people is by not falling apart when they need you to be strong. He learned it walking behind his mother's coffin. He learned it in the years of public grief that followed her death, when a whole nation seemed to be in mourning and he was expected to be a symbol of continuity. He learned it again in September 2022, when Queen Elizabeth died and the country needed him to step forward with his father into a new chapter, even as he was privately grappling with a loss that was also, for all its complexity, a genuine one. He carried that pattern into 2024. He showed up. He fulfilled his commitments where he could, reduced them where he had to, and sat beside his wife through the treatments that were changing the shape of their days. He took the children to school. He was present at Adelaide Cottage in the evenings. He was, in every way that the word means anything, there. But there is a cost to that kind of strength, and it is a cost that rarely shows up in the photographs or the official statements. It shows up in the small moments, the pauses before speaking, the tiredness in the eyes that even the best cameras cannot entirely miss, the sense, in watching him during those months, of a man who was carrying something very heavy and was determined not to set it down. People who watched his public appearances during the spring and summer of 2024 noticed it. The energy that had always seemed to come naturally to him, the easy warmth, the genuine engagement with the people he met, was still there, but it was accompanied by something else. A kind of gravity, a weight. Catherine, for her part, was doing what she had always done, only now she was doing it under conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty. The chemotherapy was hard in the way that chemotherapy is always hard. The exhaustion, the physical toll, the sense of your own body as something that has become unreliable, something that requires monitoring and medical intervention in ways that no one who has not been through it can fully understand. She was managing her children's emotional lives at the same time as managing her own medical reality. She was trying to be a mother in the fullest sense, present, reassuring, engaged, while also being a patient, which requires a very different kind of self-awareness and self-care. She was doing it largely out of the public eye, because that was what she had asked for, and because, unusually, mercifully, the British press and the watching world seemed to understand, at least to some degree, that this particular request was one they should honor. There were no paparazzi photographs of Kate leaving cancer treatment. There were no leaked accounts from hospital staff. The wall of privacy that she and William had built around their family held, and it held because people chose to let it hold, which is a kind of grace that does not always arrive in moments of crisis. In June 2024, Catherine appeared publicly for the first time since her diagnosis, at the Trooping the Color ceremony that marks the official birthday of the sovereign. She rode in a carriage with her children. She stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. She smiled and waved and wore a white dress that seemed to have been chosen with a care for symbolism that was either deliberate or uncanny. The crowd cheered for her with an intensity that went beyond the ordinary warmth of a royal occasion. It was not the cheer of people watching a princess at a parade. It was the cheer of people welcoming back someone they had been afraid of losing. She waved back. She looked, by most accounts, genuinely moved, not in the contained, managed way that royal public emotion usually operates, but in a way that suggested the response from the crowd had gotten past her defenses in a moment when her defenses were perhaps not entirely operational. It was a small thing. It lasted a few seconds, but it was seen by millions of people, and it said something that no official statement could quite capture. She was still there. She was still fighting, and the world watching her was fighting alongside her. September 2024 brought another announcement, this one delivered through a written statement rather than a video, and this one carrying news that the world had been hoping for since March. Catherine had completed her course of preventative chemotherapy. She was not in active cancer treatment. She was, in the careful language of medical and royal communications, in remission, a word that does not mean cured, a word that carries its own particular weight and uncertainty, but a word that means, at least for now, that the worst has not happened. That there is more time, that the family gathered at Adelaide Cottage still has all its members under one roof. The announcement was received with a relief so intense it had the quality of grief. People who had spent months holding their breath let it go. Tributes and messages of support came in from around the world. The newspapers, which had been treating Catherine's health with a care and restraint that was genuinely unusual, allowed themselves a moment of celebration. And somewhere in Windsor, in a house chosen for its modesty, in a life that had been stripped by illness back to its most essential components, the children, the husband, the work of getting through each day, a woman read the coverage and perhaps allowed herself, for the first time in many months, to feel something that resembled hope. But the end of treatment is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different chapter, one that no one who has not lived it can fully prepare you for. The body that has been through chemotherapy is not the same body that entered it. The life that has been interrupted by a cancer diagnosis is not the same life that resumes afterward. Things shift in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes entirely internal, in the relationship between a person and their own sense of time, in the way they think about what matters and what does not, in the distance they feel from the life they had before. For William and Kate, the end of that period of acute crisis did not mean a return to the life they had built before January 2024. It meant something else, something harder to name and in some ways harder to navigate than the crisis itself. Because in a crisis, you know what you have to do. You get through the day, you show up, you hold on. But when the crisis is over, you have to figure out who you are now, what this experience has meant, what it has changed, what the two of you have become on the other side of something neither of you chose and neither of you could have anticipated. The farewells that followed, and there were several of them, each one resonant in its own way, were not the dramatic endings of tabloid fiction. They were the quieter, more aching farewells of people who have been through something together and come out the other side changed. The farewell to the version of their life that had existed before the diagnosis. The farewell to the easy confidence of people who have not yet been directly confronted with the possibility of loss. The farewell to certain assumptions about time, about health, about what the future holds that most people carry with them unconsciously until something forces them to set those assumptions down. William and Kate, in the months following the end of treatment, were navigating all of that. They were doing it as they had always done everything together. And they were doing it in public, in the sense that their return to royal duties was watched and documented and commented upon. Every appearance analyzed for signs of how they were doing, every smile interpreted, every moment of visible connection between them treated as data in an ongoing assessment of the state of their marriage and their health and their happiness. What the cameras caught in those months of gradual return was not the performance of a couple who had been through something and come out fine. It was something more complicated and more real than that. It was the portrait of two people who had looked directly at a very frightening thing and had chosen in the looking to hold on to each other, who had been changed by what they had seen, and who were carrying that change forward into a new version of a life that was still, in all the ways that mattered, theirs. And the world, watching them, felt something that went beyond the usual mixture of curiosity and affection and projection that tends to characterize the public's relationship with the royal family. Something that was closer to recognition. The recognition of people who have been through their own difficult things, their own illnesses, their own losses, their own moments of standing in the middle of a life that has suddenly, without warning, become unrecognizable, and who saw, in the faces of William and Kate, something of their own experience looking back at them. That recognition was the root of the heartbreak that the world felt, not the heartbreak of a fairy tale ending badly, but the heartbreak of witnessing something real, something that hurt, something that cost, something that changed people, and understanding in the watching of it that the same thing can happen to anyone, that no amount of wealth or privilege or public love can protect a family from the particular darkness of a cancer diagnosis. That the fear a princess feels in a hospital ward is the same fear that anyone feels in a hospital ward. That the love a husband carries through months of his wife's illness is the same love that anyone carries through months of their partner's illness. It is a strange and powerful thing, that recognition. It is what turns a royal story into a human story. And it is what the world was really responding to in all those millions of messages and flowers and lit candles, not the princess, not the future queen, but the woman. And not the future king, but the husband. The two people doing the hardest thing there is, which is simply to keep going. When Catherine stepped back onto the public stage in the autumn of 2024, it was not with the sudden, blazing confidence of someone who has overcome something and moved past it. It was with something more measured, more careful, and in many ways more moving. She was clearly present in a way that felt different from before, more deliberate, more considered, as if each decision about where to be and what to do and how much to give had been weighed against a new and harder understanding of what her time and her energy were worth. She returned to her work. She resumed her engagement with the Early Years Initiative, the project she had been building for years around the importance of the first 5 years of a child's life in determining their long-term emotional and psychological development. She attended meetings and visited families and sat with researchers and practitioners in the field. She was focused and precise and deeply informed, not in the way of someone performing expertise, but in the way of someone who had been genuinely doing the work for a long time and had come back to it with a clarity that the months away had, if anything, sharpened. William, beside her, was finding his own footing in what had become a new landscape. The months of reduced engagements were behind him. The period of acute crisis, of being in the house, being present, being the person who held everything together while his wife was in treatment, had given way to something that required a different kind of navigation. Because the crisis was over, but the knowledge that had come with the crisis was not going anywhere. The knowledge that the most important things in your life are not the most visible things. That the work of being a husband, a father, a person who loves other people well, is done largely out of sight, in the ordinary hours of ordinary days, in the decisions you make when no one is watching and no one will ever know. He returned to his public duties with a focus that his aides and observers noted as slightly different in character from before. The causes that had always mattered to him, the Earthshot Prize, which awards funding for environmental innovation, the work on mental health through the Heads Together initiative he had co-founded with Harry and Kate years before, the long-standing commitment to supporting veterans and emergency services workers, took on a new urgency. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the urgency had always been there, and what had changed was his willingness to let it show. There were moments, in public appearances through the late months of 2024 and into 2025, when William spoke about his family's experience in terms that were more direct and more personal than he had previously been inclined toward. Not with the specific medical details that he and Kate had always protected, but with the broader truth of what the year had meant, the disruption, the fear, the rearrangement of priorities that comes when you are forced to look directly at the possibility of losing something you cannot imagine living without. He spoke about the importance of being present, about the importance of saying the things you want to say to the people you love before the moment has passed when you could say them, about the lessons that difficulty teaches that nothing else can. These were not speeches designed to generate headlines. They were, by the standards of royal communication, unusual in their directness, and perhaps that is why they landed as hard as they did. People who heard them, or read transcripts of them, or saw clips of them on social media, responded not with the detached appreciation you might give a well-crafted public address, but with something more personal, something that recognized the experience he was describing as one they knew themselves, that had sat in a hospital waiting room, that had kept vigil beside someone they loved, that had held on and kept going and come out the other side carrying a weight that never fully goes away. Kate, for her part, was speaking less and doing more, which had always been more her style. She was back in schools and community centers and research facilities, continuing the work that she had built over years. She was also, visibly, doing something else. She was allowing herself to be seen in a more unguarded way than she had typically permitted before. There were photographs, in those months of return, that caught her in moments of what looked like genuine joy, laughing with someone she had just met, reaching out to touch the hand of a child, sharing a look with William at a public event that had the quality of private communication, of two people with a long shared history saying something to each other across a crowded room without words. Those moments and the public response to them, which was immediate and warm and almost universally expressed in the language of relief, told their own story. The world had been watching these two people very carefully, and the world was now seeing something that it had been afraid it might not see. Not perfection, not the uncomplicated happiness of a fairy tale, but something more durable than either of those things. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of two people who had been through something very hard and had come through it still facing the same direction. The farewell that had left millions heartbroken was not, in the end, a final one. That is the most important thing to understand about the story of William and Kate in 2024. It was a farewell to one version of their life, the version that had existed in the confident, expansive years before illness arrived. The version in which the future seemed to extend in a straight, uninterrupted line toward a throne and a legacy, and a life fully lived in service of the country they would one day lead. That version is gone, and it is not coming back, because nothing that comes after a cancer diagnosis is ever entirely the same as what came before. But in its place is something that many people, watching from the outside, have found more affecting than anything they had previously felt about the royal family. It is the thing that comes after a farewell, the thing that survives it. The thing that turns out to be still standing when the fear has subsided, and the treatments have ended, and the life that continues is, in all its changed and difficult and precious dimensions, a life that continues. There is a way of understanding William and Kate that treats them primarily as symbols, as figures in a national narrative, as representatives of an institution that has survived centuries by adapting itself to each new era. That understanding is not wrong. They are symbols in the sense that all public figures eventually become symbols of something larger than themselves. But it is incomplete in a way that the events of 2024 made very difficult to maintain. Because what happened to them in 2024 was not symbolic. It was specific and particular and deeply human in the way that illness is always deeply human, in the way that it strips away everything that is not essential and leaves you standing in the middle of what is actually real. What was real for William and Kate in 2024 was a diagnosis, and children who needed their mother, and a husband who was afraid, and a woman who was not sure what the months ahead were going to bring and who chose, in the face of that uncertainty, to be honest about it with the world she had spent her adult life serving. That honesty, the March video, the decision to speak directly and plainly about what was happening rather than hiding behind the careful obliqueness of palace communications, was, in retrospect, one of the most significant things Kate has done in her public life. Not because it was dramatic and not because it was strategic, but because it was real. Because it showed the world something true about who she is, not the perfectly composed princess of the public imagination, but a person who was frightened and who chose to say so, who was facing something enormous and chose to face it without pretending she was not. The world's response to that honesty was a measure of something important. It was a measure of how much people had invested in Catherine over the years without always understanding the nature of that investment, not in the celebrity, but in the person they had come to believe she was. A person who would tell the truth, a person who would carry what was hers to carry without making it into a performance. A person who, even in the middle of a cancer diagnosis, was thinking about her children and trying to find the words that would protect them. William's role through all of it, quieter, less narrated, but no less real, was the role that most people who love someone through illness will recognize. It is the role of the person who keeps the household running while someone they love is too ill to help keep it running. The person who explains to the children, as simply and gently and honestly as possible, what is happening and why things are different, and when they will see the parent who has been away. The person who sits in waiting rooms and reads the medical information, and asks the doctors questions and drives home afterward, trying to hold onto the pieces of themselves that they need to keep going. It is not a glamorous role. It is not the role that fills newspaper front pages or generates the kind of coverage that the public spectacle of royal life typically produces. But it is, in the most literal sense, the most important role William could have played in 2024. And the evidence suggests, from the careful, guarded words of people who know them, from the moments caught on camera when his guard was down, from the simple fact that Kate came through treatment with her family intact, and her children stable and her marriage clearly still a place of genuine warmth and support, that he played it well. By 2025, the world was watching a different version of William and Kate than the one it had known before. Older in the most meaningful sense of the word, not just in years, but in experience, in the particular wisdom that comes from having been afraid and having kept going anyway. More deliberate in what they chose to do and how they chose to do it. Less inclined to fill every public moment with the easy busyness of a royal schedule, and more inclined to choose the moments that mattered. The engagements where their presence could make a real difference. The conversations that were more than ceremonial. The work that connected directly to the things they had learned from living through the year that had changed them. Catherine's early years' work in this period took on a new dimension. She had always spoken about the importance of emotional resilience in children, about the way that the experiences of the first years of life shape the adult's capacity to cope with difficulty. But she spoke about it now with an authority that came from somewhere more personal than research papers. She had spent 2024 managing her own emotional resilience in real time, under the most demanding conditions. She had spent it protecting her children's emotional world while her own was under enormous strain. She knew, in a way that is only available to people who have actually been through it, what it costs to keep going when keeping going is the hardest thing you have ever done. William's work, too, had a different quality to it in the months following the crisis. The Earthshot Prize he had established in 2020, a global award for innovation in environmental solutions, modeled in its ambition and its structure on the Apollo program, was entering a phase where several of its early winners were moving from innovation to implementation, and the work of supporting and amplifying their projects was becoming more complex and more interesting. He was engaged with it in a way that felt substantive, not ceremonial. And the mental health advocacy that had always been close to his heart, the work that had come, originally, from his own experience of grief, and the recognition that men in particular are not given enough permission to acknowledge their inner lives, was, in the light of what 2024 had brought, even more clearly personal. There is a question that hangs over any account of this kind, and it is a question that honest reporting requires acknowledging. The question of what we actually know and what we are projecting. The inner lives of William and Catherine are not available to us. The details of their marriage, of their private conversations, of the texture of their days at Adelaide Cottage, are and should remain their own. What we have access to are the things that are visible, the public appearances, the official statements, the moments that cameras have caught, the accounts that people who know them have shared in carefully guarded terms. Those things tell a story, but they tell only part of one. The rest, the part that is theirs and their children's, the part that takes place in ordinary hours in a house in Windsor, the part that does not appear in any official record or any newspaper account, belongs to them. And there is something important in remembering that. In remembering that the two people at the center of this story are not simply characters in a national narrative, but human beings who have been through something genuinely difficult, and who have a right to the private dimensions of their recovery, their grief, and their lives. What they have chosen to share, they have shared with a grace that is difficult to overstate. The March video alone, the courage it required, the care with which it was constructed, the humanity of the woman at the center of it, was a gift to the millions of people watching who were, in that moment, being treated as adults capable of receiving a difficult truth and being trusted to respond to it with compassion rather than sensationalism. Most of them did. The response to that video remains one of the most genuinely heartening examples of how the public relationship between a royal family and the people it represents can, at its best, function. The heartbreak that the title of this story promises, the heartbreak that millions felt, that is still felt when people look back on those months of 2024, is real. But it is important to be precise about its nature. It is not the heartbreak of tragedy. It is not the heartbreak of loss. It is the heartbreak of witness, of watching someone you have come to care about go through something very hard, of sitting with the uncertainty and the fear and the not knowing of the strange intimacy of sharing, across the distance of a screen or a newspaper page, in the private dimensions of someone else's darkest year. It is also, and this is the part that is harder to articulate, but perhaps more important, the heartbreak of recognition. Of seeing in William and Kate something of every person who has ever held the hand of someone they love through illness. Something of every family that has had to find the words to explain something frightening to children who are too young to carry it. Something of every human being who has stood at the edge of an unknown and found, in the standing, that they were more capable of continuing than they had believed they would be. The story of William and Kate in 2024 is, at its deepest level, a story about that capacity. About the human ability to absorb something enormous and keep going. About the particular form of love that is not the love of the wedding day, the love that is light and hopeful and full of the beautiful uncertainty of beginnings, but the love that comes after. The love that is tested and found not wanting. The love that is quiet and difficult and real in a way that the earlier version of itself could not yet be, because it had not yet been asked to prove what it was made of. William and Kate proved what theirs was made of in 2024. They did it without asking for recognition. They did it in the daily acts of a family doing what families do, showing up for each other, getting through the hard days, finding moments of warmth and even joy in the middle of something frightening. They did it ultimately in front of the world, not because they chose to, but because the world is always watching, and because they have accepted that this is the nature of the life they have been given and the life they have chosen. And the world watched, and the world felt something. And millions of hearts, in cities and towns and villages in countries that Catherine and William will never visit, in the homes of people whose lives could not look more different from the lives lived inside the walls of Kensington Palace or Adelaide Cottage, were genuinely and completely and quietly broken open by what they witnessed. Not because it was royal, but because it was human, because it was love. Because it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in the world. Two people choosing each other, again and again, in the hardest possible circumstances, and meaning it.